Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Paul Johnson, I'm Director of the IFS, and it is my huge pleasure and privilege to welcome you here and to welcome our speaker tonight. And I'm not going to spend too long on introductions. This is an annual event at the IFS annual lecture, as you might guess. One of the first things I did when I took over as director 12 years ago now was to move that from a world in which we had every other year we'd have a senior politician and then we'd have a senior academic or public intellectual. I thought, well, having come from the Treasury, I had enough of these sodding politicians. We're just going to move to serious people. And we've had a phenomenal array of public intellectuals, economists and others over the last few years. But it's a particular privilege actually tonight to introduce Nick Bloom, who, as I'm sure you all know, is a professor of economics at Stanford University, but actually started his working life at the IFS, actually when I was at the IFS the first time round as well, back in his case in the 1990s. And as with many of my colleagues from those days, he's gone on to extraordinary things, whereas I've just sort of stuck at the same old place. But Nick is a fantastic example of an economist who has done brilliant work that's been recognized in the top academic departments and journals, but as you all see tonight also can speak human and is addressing the most important issues in public policy. And as you'll also see tonight, right up to date in terms of talking about working from home and its impact on people, companies, and the economy. So the only other thing I want to say by way of introduction is to thank the Economic and Social Research Council, who are the funders of the Institute and Centre of Work at the IFS, which is the most important part of our funding and is responsible for the fact we are just about able to afford this wonderful space this evening and able to have all of you here to hear what I'm sure will be a fantastic lecture from Nick, who will speak for around 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. But I will finish dead on 8 because nothing's going to keep me, at least, from the drinks in the other room.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for that lovely introduction. I was going to start by saying 2 sets of thanks. First in my title, so does working from home have a future? You know, to avoid any suspense, the answer is yes. I don't know, I guess it's pretty obvious by now. I'm going to start with 2 sets of thanks. The first is to the IFS. So as Paul mentioned, I had my first full-time job was at the IFS. I started in 1996, which I realized yesterday was more than a quarter of a century ago. So it feels like a long time. I was there for 5 years. It's funny, I was thinking almost all of that time at the IFS was full-time in person in the office. I had one incident I remember of working from home, which probably doesn't forbade that well, which is, I remember, back in, it was probably about 1999, I told Rachel Griffiths, my boss, that I was going to work from home the next day. And that was the plan. And the next day I got up planning to work from home, and some of my friends rang up and said, look, we're going to the park. Would you like to come along? So I thought, this sounds like a good plan. So I went along to the park and ended up spending most of the day at the park. And in the afternoon, I remember we had somebody found these sticks, and we were like playing around jousting with these sticks, and I got hit in the head and like gashed quite badly. And so I turned up the next day at work really sunburned with a big gash on my forehead. And Rachel said, weren't you working from home yesterday? And I should have probably seen this coming. I should have probably been honest. I just lied and said, oh, this was from mowing the lawn. And Rachel said, but you have a tiny lawn. And it was like, and then what about the gash? And at that point, I just looked at the floor, and it was, thankfully she didn't say anything, and we just moved on. I think it was understood what had happened. The other person I wanted to thank is Jeremy Hunt, for a weird way, for making this so topical. And I'll come back to what Jeremy Hunt said maybe right at the end. But Jeremy Hunt, yesterday, and we saw this morning BlackRock, and today Elon Musk, it just never seems to die, this work from home. So I'm going to start. I talk a lot to MBAs and execs in Stanford. Just when you do that, you have to kind of explain where you're coming from. So I've been working from home weirdly since 2004. In fact, I remember doing some surveys in the LSE, the building that's probably just across there actually, back in 2004. no one was that interested in this topic until March 2020. You can imagine it's kind of a pretty dry, boring topic. And then from that point onwards, things have really taken off. So over the last 3 years, I've collected a lot of data I go through. I've also ended up talking to a large number of companies, not-for-profits, you know, my local city council, the hospital, the school board, etc. So I'll try and draw on both of those in what I talked through today. So I'm going to go through 3 things. So the first third is going to be kind of facts. Where are we currently on working from home? The second third is going to be how to manage this. What will be the right way to manage working from home, particularly hybrid. So hybrid's the thing that firms, organizations really struggle with. And if you see the discussion in the media, it's normally focused on that. And then finally, I have 5 impacts on the economy. And I end by talking about golf. So to be, as a, you know, a subline, I don't actually play golf, but it's one of the largely affected outcomes of work from home, as we'll come back to see. So firstly, what's the data look like? So work from home is not really a binary thing. Some people work 1, 2, 3 days a week. So probably the best way to measure it is the share of full paid days that people work from home. So that affects office space. It affects commuting. This is US data. I'll show you in a bit. The US and UK look incredibly similar. I have slightly better US data. As you know, I live in the US now. I've been collecting, you know, US focused data, but it's going to be very, very similar to the UK. And I'll show you some UK data in a minute. So for the US, what do we know? Pre-pandemic, as in the UK, about 5% of days were work from home. So it's very rare. So people did work from home. You know, they actually did work sometimes rather than go to the park, but it was pretty rare. During the pandemic, this surged to about 60% of time. So anyone that could work from home during the peak of the pandemic was doing that, and they're doing it pretty much full time. You notice that this is now dropping back down. By the middle of 2022, it's dropped to about 30%, and it's really flattening off to about 25%. The blue is our data. We've been surveying 10,000 US working employees a month. We reweight it to the labor force of age 20 to 64. The red is the census data. They collect 50,000 data points a month, but they line up pretty well. So I think in both cases, one thing to note is people ask, you know, is working from home disappearing? The answer, if you look at the aggregate data, not really. It's just been flat. So at this point on this aggregate data, we are kind of post-pandemic. Eventually, this thing will flatten out maybe at 25% by the end of 23, 24. As I'll explain on the very last slide, this thing is kind of like a Nike swoosh. In the long run, it's going to go back up, driven by technological improvement. So, you know, we're not far off the low point. If you think of 2026, 2030, I think we'll be higher. What about international data? So this is a cross-country survey I've been involved in. We ran waves in 21, 22. We're currently in the field. I don't quite have the data. It'll be out in the next 2-3 weeks. What you see here, here's the UK. This is for graduates because it's comparable. The typical university graduate in the UK is working from home about 2.5 days a week. I'm guessing if I had a show of hands, like the most common hybrid pattern is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office, Monday, Friday at home, so 2 days a week. That looks very similar to the US, Canada. So basically North America, Northern Europe, grads are on about 2, maybe 3 days a week. You go into Southern Europe, levels look lower. You go into Asia, levels look significantly lower. So Australia, you know, it's kind of odd. Australia, the Anglo-Saxon world, has pretty high levels of work from home. You go into Asia at the other extreme, particularly mainland China, it's quite a bit lower. This is our survey data. This is another data set. This is from JLL. They're a big commercial property company. They have office occupancy data, very similar. So if you look here, you know, I like it how they define, you know, high as 75 to 90. They're doing their best to persuade people. Everyone's back in the office. I would call 75 to 90% of pre-pandemic levels low. This very low. This very, very low. But, you know, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder here. So this is as a share of pre-pandemic occupancy. If you look, North America is about 50, 60%. People are going into the office about half as much as they were pre-pandemic. That is an enormous thing. City centers are semi-empty. Public transit, as I show you, is used a lot less. UK, very similar. Frankfurt, very similar. You know, some of Southern Europe is a bit higher. Asia's higher still. Here's another data set, a third way of looking at it. This is data with a team from Peter Hansen, you know, a bunch of co-work authors, including some at UCL and LSE, where we've been scraping online job postings. So there's a data set used to be called Burning Glass. It's now called Lightcast. It contains the universe of all online job postings. It turns out pretty much everyone, it has an online job posting. If you go to the very lowest jobs, the kind of bottom 1 or 2%, they're often illegal. They're not posted online. If you go to the top jobs, if Manchester City is looking for I doubt they need a new striker, but if they're looking for a new striker, they also don't post that job advert online. But pretty much everything in between, 9% of jobs are there. We scrape them using a kind of complicated algorithm to look at the share that are work from home, mention it explicitly. This has a different pattern. So what happened earlier in the pandemic, everyone went to fully, all of us in this room, I'm guessing pretty much everyone here was probably fully remote, at least in April, May 2020. Employers were very nervous about committing. They didn't know it was going to last. If you look at job postings from that era, they didn't typically talk about it. They would, when you turned up, say, look, you can be at home. When the pandemic ends, you're coming back into the office. As time has gone on, certainly by 2022, employers got to the view that this is here to stay. If you look at job postings now, they're a lot higher, and there's a lot more commitment. So this is another sense in that work from home is here to stay. In job postings, people are now committing to openly when you're hired. So that's aggregate levels. Who's actually working from home, who's not? There are 3 groups in society, and this comes up a lot. It's generated. I don't know if you read Elon Musk's comments. Basically, almost at this point, everything Elon Musk says is the exact reverse of what I think. I kind of define myself as the precise inverse of Elon Musk. He was against vaccines, believes the election was all kinds of crazy stuff. Elon Musk today, there was some truth in what I said, so I explain what this data says. So if you look in the UK, US, Canada, Australia, there are really 3 groups. The biggest group is actually people that cannot work from home at all. So the folks serving our drinks, the people that clean the room afterwards, the people that if you took an Uber drove you here, retail, manufacturing, healthcare, a lot of education, all our kids, the teachers are back full time. This is about 60% of the workforce. They're actually typically the lowest paid group. They're the biggest group, so they just don't get any work from home at all. The next biggest group is hybrid. They're about 30%. That's probably, if I think of my students at Stanford, they're almost all in that group. LSE, UCL, King's, all of the kind of graduates typically are in this group. It's about 30% of the workforce. It's about 50% of payroll. This is a big deal. This is the thing that people are struggling with. And then the final group's fully remote. This group's about 12%, and it's declining quite fast. So this group was about 60% of the peak of the pandemic. Everyone that could work from home was. As time has gone, it's declined and declined and declined. Why is that? Well, many folks have been pulled back into the office. So if your boss is Elon Musk, you've been told you're going to go back, just pretty much any organization. If you look at who these are, most of these jobs now that they're left are IT support, payroll, HR, benefits, call centers. The reason it's declining now is slightly different. These folks now are slowly being moved offshore. And in the next 2-3 years, I think these are the kind of jobs that are going to start to be replaced actually by AI. I was talking to a friend that's working on call centers out in India. And she was saying already call center numbers in India are starting to decline because they're facing massive threat from chatbots. And these chatbots are like terrible now. They're so frustrating. Like they only want to tell you your balance. I'm like, I'm not contacting you to know my balance. I actually want help with something else. But you can imagine as AI gets better and as these jobs are offshored, this group is falling. So this fully remote share in the UK is declining reasonably rapidly. This thing is staying and this thing is staying. So this will not completely go, but I wouldn't be surprised if this hits 5%. So there's going to be really 2 big groups. There's going to be folks that are fully in person and folks that are hybrid. Here's a long run graph. This is US data. It goes back to 1965. There were people working fully remotely back in 1965. Is about 0.5%. Everyone thinks, who is this? It's maybe farmers. I don't know who was working from home in 1965. There's a little bit of it. As time goes on, levels increase and increase and increase, and it's driven very much by technology. So my parents are here. When I was, which is very nice, it's a lovely thing. So when I was a kid, I'm one of 4 children. Both my parents worked. I remember they would work from home in the 80s and in the 90s to try and basically provide childcare. So they'd take it in turns to work from home. I remember that era of working from home, no personal computers. So back in the 80s, it was shuffling pieces of paper. It was not a fantastic experience. I've interviewed people, Jack Nillis that talked about it in the 70s. It really was not great. Personal computers come in the 90s, the internet by 2000s, it's the cloud. In some ways, 2010 is the biggest breakthrough. Dropbox is formed in 2009. Zoom is founded in 2012. If you think of what we're doing now, those two are really critical because now all the time we're working remotely, we share files and we're on video calls. So, and I remember when I was working from home in 2005, it was like freeconferencecall.com and emailing files all the time. It wasn't great. So I want to point out this thing has been doubling roughly every 15 years, driven by improvements in technology. And then it's basically had 50 years of growth in another 2 years. So it's growing, it's jumped up. These improvements in technology, I'll come back to at the end, are still ongoing. I live out in Silicon Valley, and like every hardware, software company, every startup has now said work from home is an enormous market. Let's accelerate the pace of innovation. Actually, early in the pandemic, I talked to Satya Nadella, and he said they've put a lot more effort. You know, if you use Skype, it probably doesn't seem like it, but they've put a lot more time and effort into improving Teams. So this thing is going to drop and eventually start heading back up again because it's going to revert to its pre-pandemic trend. This is a graph for which work from home is on the right. The thing on the left, I think, is much more amazing. So I found this is kind of astounding as a data point. So this on the left is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It is the share of spending in the US that's online. If you're eagle-eyed, you'll notice the y-axis is in logarithmic, it's a log scale. So that means that straight line means percentage growth rate. So online spending was growing at a kind of, a few percent every year before the pandemic. There's no surprise. Amazon, Instacart, blah, 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 was pushing this up. Early on in the pandemic, it surges. So I probably, like everyone else, we flipped to Safeway and using Instacart and everything because it was very hard to shop early on, so we were getting all our home delivery. What's amazing is it's back to trend. I mean, it's kind of incredible. The pandemic led to no permanent increase in online shopping. It's actually led to no permanent change in eating out, in air travel is actually up, attendance at Premier League games, NFL games, everything is back to pre-pandemic trends. It's as if the pandemic never happened. The one thing that's totally different is work from home. And as I explained at the end, everything that's downstream of this. So property markets, commercial, golf as it happens is even affected, use of gyms. So it may be that one of the biggest legacies, at least the biggest economic legacy, I think, of the pandemic is going to be the shift to work from home. If I think back to things that have impacted the labor market this, dramatically, it probably was World War II. So World War II, men went off to fight. There was a big increase of women working in factories and government. That led to a permanent increase in women's labor force participation. This is probably the next thing that was just that consequential. Here's variation by industry. I put this up because certainly living in Silicon Valley, and if you read the media, they're like obsessed with tech. Like every time there's a work from home story, it's always some tech firm. But tech is a complete outlier. They're the highest industry in terms of work from home. No one ever talks about hospitality and food services, somehow forgotten. It's worth noting academics, financial services, business services are at the higher end. There are a number of industries where it's hard. They tend to be face-to-face. They tend to be, slightly less graduate-focused. Tech, we shouldn't take our lead from tech, put it that way. Tech is a bit of an outlier. We should take our lead, I guess, from other sectors. And then here is data split by gender. When I show people this, they're always quite surprised. I say, this is one of the things people seem quite surprised by. There's really no difference in levels of work from home by gender. It's statistically significant. If you were to test it, women have about 1 to 2% higher work from home levels than female than male employees, but the gap is not very big if you look at the overall scale. So, I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A. There's factors that push in both directions. Where we do see the gap is by education. So the really big thing is college or university graduates have about twice the level of work from home as non-graduates. So the big divider in the labor market is basically, are you a graduate? Do you use a computer? Can you work from home? Or if you're not a graduate, you tend to be unable to work from home. So that's the data. Why is hybrid? I'm guessing, I was to do a straw poll of people that professionals, managers, I talked to, honestly, hundreds and hundreds of firms. They've all adopted hybrid. Why is hybrid so popular? There are 4 reasons, of which by far the biggest is number 1. So this is the one that's really driving everything. I spend a bit of time on this, then go through the other 3. They're important, but they've, when I talk to managers, CEOs, CHRs, this is the thing they focus on. It keeps employees happy. So what do we know in the data? What facts do we have? When we survey folks, they report, and this is US data, done it for the UK, for Europe, around the world. It's actually very consistent. People report the ability to work from home 2 days a week is worth about the same as an 8% pay increase. So that's a lot of money. So you may be surprised. On the other hand, if you can work 2-3 days a week at home, you can move out to the suburbs. You save a lot of time on commuting. You can have more space. You know, a lot of things come downstream from that. That tells you that, you know, as a manager, if you want to haul folks back into the office, if you want to be, you know, I won't mention names, but some of the investment banks have been saying, or I will mention names actually. You know, Jamie Dimon for JP Morgan has said he wants managing partners and up to come in 5 days a week. If you want to do that, you're probably looking at paying them about 8% over and above a pay increase. So if you think the standard pay increase right now is 7-8% because of high inflation, maybe 6%, think of adding on 8% on top of that. No firm is paying people 14% more. So it's become just very, very expensive, frankly, to get people back in full time. Another way to look at it is I actually ran a randomized control trial out in Shanghai in a company called Trip.com. So they're one of the world's big 3 travel agents. They're like Expedia, but they're slightly more Asia focused. They're called Ctrip in China. You may have used them. They have about 40,000 employees. They're a massive NASDAQ listed company. I have some connection. I was very fortunate. Their founding CEO and chairman was in my class in Stanford like 15 years ago. So I'm still involved with talking to the company, and they ran a randomized control trial whereby they took 1,600 graduate employees. So these are folks in marketing, accounting, tech, and finance. And they randomized them by people with an even birthday. So if you're born on the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th, 10th of the month, you had to stay in the office 5 days a week. If you had an odd birthday, only in China would this be possible. If you have an odd birthday, if you're born on the 1st, 3rd, 5th of the month, you got to work from home 2 days a week. And in fact, they said you can work from home on Wednesday and Friday, copying the Apple model. So that's what Tim Cook announced in Apple. Question is what happened? Not much happened in productivity. It was slightly up, but it was basically flat. There are some minor changes. The big thing was quit rates fell by 35%. So there was a massive reduction in quit rates. The board ran this experiment for 6 months, looked at the data, said there's no downsides. Every person that quits cost us several $1,000s. There's only upsides. They just rolled it out to the whole company. So this is another good example. It has a dramatic, large reduction in quit rates. One thing to point out is it's not, people kind of bounce from one extreme to another, certainly in the media. It's not the case that people want to work from home 5 days a week. If you survey people, on average, they want to work from home about 2.5 days a week. If you ask how many people want to work from home fully, it's less than half, particularly 20-somethings are extremely unkeen. This demographic really wants to come into the office to get mentored. They want to be social. A lot of them are single. And there's another big problem. Think of their living arrangement. So often, 4 of them in a flat. No one wants to work from home in their bedroom. It's very depressing. It's like prison cell-like. You sleep and work in a room for 20 hours a day. If there's 4 of you, it's very hard to come into a common room. So what we see very clearly is people, particularly 20-somethings, want to come in typically 2-3 days a week. So hybrid turns out to be roughly what employees want on average. So this is why, for keeping employees happy, this is where it's landed very squarely there. What about productivity? This is the stuff that Elon Musk, David Solomon, Jamie Dimon, I think the Chancellor yesterday were talking about. So there's 2 really different cases here that get often confused. Now, I'll go to them very, very, very clearly. So one case is fully remote. So this is a case where I'm working from home 5 days a week, week in, week out. I'm basically never coming to the office. There is a bunch of research papers, including some stuff in Nature Human Behavior, a number of papers now, several more in the pipeline, that say typically fully remote reduces productivity by about 10 to 20%. There's less mentoring, there's less innovation, it's high, people have self-control problems at home. There's the old joke that, the 3 enemies of work from home are the bed, the fridge, and the television. People often fall victim to one or many of those. So fully remote turns out to be 10 to 20% less productive. You may then ask, why does anyone do this? The reason they do this is it saves a lot of money. So if I'm a CEO and I have my back office staff to be fully remote, firstly I save an office space. That's maybe 10, 20% overhead. So I'm already at break even. I can then typically take these jobs, if it's in London, send them to some lower wage part of the UK where I can hire people at maybe 10, 20% less, or increasingly internationally. So when I talk to companies, they're saying, look, the reason we do fully remote is these folks are working in Bulgaria, or Nigeria, or Mexico, or the Philippines, etc. And the costs are about 30 to 40% of they would on premises. Sure, they may be 20% less productive, but they're 80% cheaper. So this is entirely a cost play, which tells you you're really at risk if you're in London and you're fully remote because it's very hard to compete. Hybrid is completely different. So the evidence on hybrid, there's a number of papers coming out. I have some and some others showing, if anything, what I say is organized hybrid, which is you're in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, everyone comes in, it's social, there's meetings, there's presentations, there's training, there's mentoring, and Monday, Friday, you go home. This looks like it actually increases productivity a bit. Why is that? People are kind of surprised, how could it do it? There's really two reasons. So one is when you work from home, it's quieter. There's a lot of evidence that home is quieter than the office. I remember someone called this, there's a cake in the breakout room effect. There's like this noisy, there's people watching the World Cup, there's people arguing in the office. There's some of the best evidence on the impact of quiet. There's some surveys done by educational psychologists in the 90s and 2000s. One of my favorite is they took several hundred students and they had them all sit a maths test. They all wore headphones, and randomly half of them had office noise piped through the headphones, the other one just had quiet. And not surprisingly, the folks with office noise, their test scores were like, 2 standard deviations lower because it's just hard to concentrate. We found in an earlier randomized control trial I did back in 2010, in call centers, people were processing about 4% more calls per minute at home, and they just said it's quiet, I can hear what's going on. So that's one big benefit. The other is time saved. So the average Brit is commuting about 60 minutes a day. So they work from home, there's 30 minutes each way, they save an average 1 hour. They save, and I'll show you where it comes from on the next slide, about another 10 minutes of less grooming. So you can probably guess where this is heading. I'll show you some of the horrible details. So the average Brit saves about 70 minutes a day working from home. And where does that time go? Well, about 40% of that time, which is 30 minutes, goes on working more for the primary job. The rest of it goes on, leisure, childcare, etc. But if you're an employer and you have somebody work from home Monday, Friday, they're working about an hour extra a week for you. So these two effects are what give you small. They're not massive. They're 2-3%. But as long as productivity is not down, if it makes employees happier, there's really, there's what's not to like. And that's kind of where all organizations are at. Where does this 9-10 minutes come from? Well, I don't know if you can see the numbers. This is the kind of horrifying slide. So we ask people, when you go to work and when you go work from home, how often do you have a shower or bath each day? How often do you wear fresh clothes? How often do you brush your teeth? You'd think it would be 100, no. How often do you shave, put on makeup, use deodorant? The hilarious thing from showing this to people is they always have two comments. One is like, they're less surprised by the red thing. They're more horrified by the blue thing. They're like, you mean there are people, there are 93.4, there's whatever. There's 6.3% of people coming into the office every day wearing, dirty clothes, or people that don't brush their teeth. And then the second comment is always something like, wait a minute, I think that's Stuart from accounts. Like his breath stinks. And the last time he's had that same egg stain on his t-shirt for 3 days in a row. It's like, I think we can all kind of guess who that might be, but maybe that's another reason for working from home. The blue bar forces you into the red bar. So then the third point is on diversity. So to explain this, this is data from us. This is also data from Future Forum from Slack. We survey people on diversity, and the question we ask them is less than 10% of your workforce in the same race, same gender, same politics, same religion, or same decade, so 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. What you see is folks that are diverse in the sense of less than 10% of their co-workers in one of these dimensions have a slightly higher preference to work from home. So to be clear, it's not that they want to work fully remotely, but they find it, they have a slightly stronger preference to working, let's say, 2 days a week at home. So I'm 50, I'm obviously not, but most of these things I wouldn't be a minority. But if I was in, say, a workplace full of 20-year-olds, it's not that they have to be particularly aggressive, but they're on, I don't know, I'm not on TikTok. My oldest daughter's like that. It's just, you can see in any dimension, people at Republicans say conservatives or Labour, whatever it is, say, look, I just find it less pleasant. No one around me is like me. They're very different, which is why if you try and be tough and force folks back in 5 days a week, you can imagine who's first to quit. So this is another issue for, particularly investment banks getting really tough, forcing employees back 5 days a week. You can guess who's going to quit first. These are typically the employees they actually really want to keep. And then finally, space. Space is like the big disappointment. we haven't been able to save a lot of space. So the space that's been saved is mainly back office. So a lot of companies, I worked in McKinsey and in the Treasury, and a lot of these organizations, I remember the folks that were in support tended to be in the middle of the office. They tended to be in the less nice, not so heavily windowed rooms. These folks have often gone fully remote, but that's typically 10% of floor plan. The rest of employees, if they're coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, how do you save space? Now, there are solutions around this. You can have, Team A come in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Team B on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Team C on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But it turns out that's not that appealing. A, if teams are working across each other, you have matrix organizations, no one's in on the same day. B, people have to clear desk. It's hard to get people to clean desk. You leave sensitive stuff out. C, someone has to come in on Friday. No one wants to come in on Friday. Someone has to come in on Monday. So most execs I talk to are saying this kind of rota system is just too complicated. It's also very hard to enforce. So, if I can see Carol here, but if, I know I'm worried that Carol's not coming in to work enough days. If I don't know which day she's supposed to be in it, sorry, I shouldn't pick on someone in the audience. It's harder to enforce it. So most companies have gone to coming into the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and saying, look, we can't save much space. It is what it is. So what's the current state of managing hybrid work from home? How would I advise companies do this? So in some senses, this is the single most important data slide I think I have. If there's one slide, it will be this, which is we ask people, what are the top 3 benefits of working on your employer's business premises? And what you notice is numbers 1 and 2 are face-to-face collaboration and socializing. People come in to basically see co-workers and work with them. Notice time with manager is like way down here. People do not come in to spend time with their manager. They basically come in to spend time together. And unless you get people in on the same days by having anchor days and forcing some coordination, it's very hard to get them to stick. My favorite example of a disastrous policy was Google. So about a year and a half ago, Google initially had this very free choice thing, and they were upset that people weren't coming in. So they said, I know, we'll get Lizzo in. So Google has the Lizzo concert, and the entire of Google came in for that day to see Lizzo, and then the next day they just went home again. And it was like, what are Google going to do? Are they going to get like Taylor Swift the next day and Katy Perry and Justin Bieber? And it doesn't work. Gimmicks and things like that tend not to work. What really works is basically having everyone in on the same day. So this is why, again, anchor days and coordinating on, say, 2 or 3 days a week is where firms are going. Because the reason, the best way to piss off employees is to have them come in and spend all day on Zoom. They get really annoyed. So coordination is really important. If you look at what firms are doing, particularly larger employees, they're typically coordinating either at the company level. So Disney, for example, has you work in the office for 4 days, work from home on Friday. Apple, for example, has Monday, Friday at home, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office. Or they're letting teams choose. They're saying team by team, group by group, you choose. In some ways, this is a bit of a false choice because of this figure. So this is the days that people come into the office. Notice Friday is a complete ghost town. So good luck trying to get anyone in on Friday. Monday is pretty popular to work from home. So it's kind of like telling your kid that look, your bedtime can be 9 o'clock or 9:05. It's like there isn't really a lot of choice. If you tell people they're going to come in for 3 days, pretty regularly they're going to pick Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. If you pick 2 days, there's some more choice in there. But companies have, there's some 50-50 between top-down centralizing or giving individual teams choice. A problem that we find is actually enforcing this. So we have some other data where we ask managers and separately employees, what happens when someone doesn't come in? And this, when I talk to execs, this is their gripe all the time. I set the policy. I said everyone has to come in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, turn up on Wednesday, and the place is empty. We ask managers, so what do you do when employees don't turn up on their days? And the most common thing is that I threaten to terminate them, like really tough, or I verbally reprimand them, like they're doing what I say. When we ask employees, the answer is most typically nothing. So there's like some serious disconnect here. And over time, I think enforcement's going up, but this has been a real problem. So my advice, I'll come back to it. My advice is pick 3 days and actually try and enforce it in a reasonable way. So when I talk to company leaders or, CHRs, etc., generally I'd suggest coordinating 2 or 3 days. People don't want to come in when no one else is there. So pick 2 days, try and make it work. Pick 3 days, try and make it work. Don't have some kind of, somewhat semi-random process. I would promote in-person meetings, events, training, coffees on those days. I actually spoke to the board of a company called Panera Bread that aren't in the UK. They're like Pret a Manger. They're really big in the US. They said they're making as much sandwich sales to businesses post-pandemic as pre-pandemic, but no one's buying them on Monday, Friday. So basically, everyone's buying sandwich lunches on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I was in the RFest. I had a sandwich lunch. It wasn't from Panera, but it was on Wednesday. There you go. So, try and promote in-person events, maybe put on free lunch if that's what it needs, but make sure that people are there and coordinating with each other. On the home days, suggest cross-office meetings, reading, writing, etc. I would also get tougher on anchor days. So if employees are supposed to be in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, if their kid is sick or the water pipe bursts or their car's been stolen, fine. But kind of like in 2019, if they say it's cold or they want to watch the World Cup or whatever it is, that's not that was fine in 2021, but I think going forward these aren't really legitimate excuses. And then finally, for new hires, generally new hires want the most training and mentoring. So this is possibly add an extra day. Years ago, I worked in McKinsey. I remember in McKinsey, my intake, there were 20 of us, had every Friday we met together. We also met with a senior manager. So you can easily think for companies, for new hires, have them come in for 1 day a week extra, say on Friday, and have different senior managers rotate around. The reason is mentoring is much better in person. So this is data on how much you mentor others, depending on whether you work from home, come into work. These groups are the critical groups. They're middle to senior managers. Notice they do almost twice as much mentoring if they're in person as at home. So if you want to get trained, you want to mentor, you need to come in. So particularly for new hires. So before I go to the impact, then I go to 3 other tips I picked up, over the last few years, 2-3 years on how to manage hybrid. So the first is performance reviews. So this came from a story. I spoke to Marissa Mayer, which I'm not sure how many people remember. Marissa Mayer she was the CEO of Yahoo from 2012 to 2016. She banned work from home in 2013. It was an enormous media storm. She got kind of, massacred in the press. It was a nightmare for her. I emailed her about 2 years ago, and she kind of said, well, I'm happy. I'm not talking to the media ever again, but I will talk to a professor. So I managed to get a bit of time talking to her. And she kind of explained very much this story. So Marissa said, look, when I took over Yahoo in 2012, they didn't have any good performance management systems. It was very hard to tell who was working, who wasn't. So what you were basically doing is relying on, is somebody at their desk typing, appearing to work? When you walk past, is it Excel or Outlook or Word? Do they look like they're doing something? Said it's not great management practices, maybe like 5 out of 10. You're basically input evaluating people, but it's better than nothing. Said the problem is when folks are working from home, you can't tell what was going on. She said about a year into being at Yahoo and putting in these performance evaluation systems, she said she discovered this fully remote team she didn't know existed. And so she said, well, what are they up to? What are they doing? And apparently there was like, we're not really quite sure. Like, well, what data do we have? And it turned out really the only data they had was logins for the laptops. So she said, okay, well, let's pull the login data. Let's have a look. Turns out that several of these employees, not only was their login level low, so you're probably thinking low is like 2-3 hours a day. Some of them hadn't logged in for several weeks. They were basically, they probably had another job. They may have left the country 3 years. I mean, one of the things that turns out to be really critical is performance evaluation systems. It turns out it's about as important for employees as it is for managers. So if Paul is managing me, for him it's much easier if he has a performance evaluation system, because on a Monday and Friday he's not stressing and checking on my answering emails, am I answering Slack? If he pings me, do I immediately respond? Instead, he knows I just have a strong internal incentive to get my job done. I, in reverse, as an employee, actually should prefer this, because if I want to go play golf, go pick my kids up from work, go to the dentist, I can do that and then make up for in the evenings and the weekends. And in fact, in the randomized control trial for TRIP I mentioned earlier with 1,600 people, what you see is on Wednesday, Fridays, they work about 2 hours less. So on their work from home days, they are doing less time. But on the other days on the weekend, they're making up for it. When you interview them, they say, look, if I want to go to the dentist, it's a lot easier on a Wednesday than a weekend. If I want to go to the gym, and I'm not that bothered about losing an hour of TV watching on Netflix or whatever it is at night. So performance evaluation systems are a gain on both sides. B is cameras on, very sensitive topic. So I'm talking about small meetings here. So this, I guess my screenshot is kind of bigger. When we've asked both managers and employees, during work meetings on Teams or Zooms or WebEx, does having your camera on impact your engagement? Pretty heavily, the view is positively or very positively. I get in large meetings of 30, 40 people, it's not necessary. But one of the other norms is, on work from home days, it's probably a good idea to try and norm having a camera on, at least if it's 2 or 3 people. And then finally, just redesigning the offices. So this is like old. I don't know how many people does anyone recognize where that's from? So I didn't want to show any actual company. This is actually from Mad Money. Sorry, no, Mad Men. Sorry, Mad Men. I'm getting confused with that terrible investment advice show. That somebody calculated the alpha on Mad Money and it's negative, so don't watch it. He actually loses money. So, but this is from Mad Men, which is, lots of these individual cubicle offices. This is cubicle land. This is actually from an advertising photo. This kind of stuff is being shrunk down, replaced with conference rooms, because when people are in there in more conference rooms, a lot of Zoom cubicles and areas to have, hybrid meetings. So finally, I'll talk about 5 impacts on the economy, then I'll stop. Number one, I guess it's, we haven't had dinner yet, but there's the donut effect. I saw the FT pick this up earlier in the week. So the donut effect is we have data. I'll show you first for US cities, then show you a bit about London and some other cities. So here's New York. New York have very good data. In the US, you have what's called the United States Postal Service change of address data. So it shows you net flows by zip code by month. It's a pretty amazing data set. What you can see in large US cities is people have left the city centers, gone out to the suburbs. Across all US cities, there's about 1 million people that have left the centers, gone to the suburbs. Not surprisingly, prices of property in the suburbs have gone up a lot. In the very city centers, they're actually down in real terms. They've not kept up with inflation. I haven't got you. I've heard stories in the UK. My guess is similarly that the suburbs have gone up a lot. Why is that? Well, look, pre-pandemic, if you had to go into work every day, it's appealing to be in the city center. You save on commute. Now the story is you've got to go into work maybe 2 or 3 days. You can put up with a longer commute, but you'd really like a home office. And so, you can imagine if 1 million people move out to the suburbs, it puts prices and rents up a lot. They've gone up about 50%. These things are about flat. Here's different data. I don't have exactly the same data for London and other countries. Instead, we're working with MasterCard. So with MasterCard, they've been processing their transaction data. There's like billions and billions of transactions. And what we've developed is an index which shows the change versus 2019 of transactions in the 2 kilometers around the city center, which for London would be around Trafalgar Square, versus the change from kilometers 3 up to 40. So it's kind of a city center spending versus the suburbs. And if you look at London, you can see spending in the city center, according to MasterCard, fell by 50% at the very, in the middle of the pandemic, and is kind of back to level. So in the UK, in London at least, there isn't that much evidence of a donut. Sao Paulo, New York, Paris, these things are kind of noisy because MasterCard have vendors coming and going. This is all 40 cities across Europe, the US. You can see there was a clear exodus of spending and activity from city centers. It's recovering, but it's still not totally back. So my guess is this thing will never totally recover. It was actually, so there has been some permanent shift out. So that's fact one. Fact two is public transport, the tube, particularly British Rail, is in real trouble. I actually spoke to, I forgot what they're called, Network UK, blank on the name, they used to be called British Rail, about a few months ago, and they are really struggling. So commuter journeys are down a lot. It turns out one of the things they've really got messed up in is no one's buying season tickets anymore. Because if you're not going in 5 days a week, what's the point? So season tickets was advanced spending. That's fallen by like 90%. The same is true in the US. Turns out what's dropped most is more expensive rail. Bus tends to be more taken by people that go in every day, face-to-face lower-income workers. That's not dropped as much. Rail, particularly commuter rail, is really down. This is actually a big problem. These systems have very high fixed costs, very low variable costs. So if you're British Rail, the track, the station, the trains, even if nobody takes it, the costs are more or less the same, but now your revenue's down 50%. I don't know. This is the scariest thing, to be honest, out of all of this. I don't know what's going to happen. I would not be surprised if some public transit systems reduce service, some of them go bankrupt. This is, if there's anything I'm most worried about, is this. Here's a positive thing in reverse. Again, I'm going to show you US data, but this is startup rate. So it turns out the US has an extremely good measure for startups, which is every time somebody starts a company, they have to get an employee identification number from the IRS. It's basically the same as inland revenue. They track that extremely closely. Startup rates were kind of growing in line with the economy up to the pandemic. No one's starting a business during the pandemic. I mean, I'm astounded this thing doesn't go to zero. I don't really know who's starting a business, in March, April 2020, but some people were, but it's a lot less. It then rebounds here, which is no surprise. Everyone's put off, but it's about 20% above trend. And this, this has been noticed. There's been a lot of coverage of this. This is primarily, we think, driven by work from home. Why? Well, if you want to start a new business, it's a lot cheaper if you don't need the office. And also, a lot of new businesses start as a side gig for someone that has a main job. Their main job they're doing, they may be working from home on Monday and Friday. They're doing, some transactions on the evenings. They're able to start their new business. Point 4, and then I end on golf, is it's really changed the labor markets. I talked about this a bit earlier. I talked to lots of execs and CEOs that would say things like, you know what, Team X has been really great, fully remote. And I'm not really sure we ever want to bring them back in the firm, or we might outsource them, or we may be moving to temporary or offshoring. In many ways, this is pretty good. I think this will increase labor supply. There are a lot of folks that are near retirement, or maybe just had kids, young children, people with disabilities that may not have worked if it was full-time going into the office 5 days a week. If they're offered, say, 3 days a week, of which 1 or 2 is at home, they keep working. So this, I think, is good news, but it's made much more flexibility in the labor market. I think it will increase labor supply. So long run, this is maybe the biggest boost to growth. I wouldn't be surprised if 1 or 2% of more people are working just because it's more appealing. Finally, golf. Again, I don't play golf, but I started looking at this because I heard so many execs were saying stuff like, it's impossible to get a slot on a golf course anymore. So working with a student, we got data from something called INRIX. So INRIX tracks vehicle GPS and mobile phone data. It tracks, in the US, about 140 million journeys a day. It's an incredibly large data set. You can identify golf courses by satellites very easy. So you look at journeys to golf courses between 2 to 6 hours. It's a pretty good proxy for playing golf. What you can see is pre-pandemic, people are playing golf on Saturday, Sunday. Post-pandemic, sure, they're still playing golf on Saturday, Sunday. They're just playing it throughout the week as well. Basically, when I spoke to golf, I rang up and spoke to 2 or 3 golf courses to ask them. And they were like, it's insane. Like the course is just full from the moment it's open to the moment it closes. And one of them was saying, normally people don't play in the rain. Now there are people out there playing in the rain. And, we have to haul them off because there's threat of lightning strikes. And they're really angry with us. And we're like, you're going to get electrocuted. They're like, we need to play. There's no other time left. So this is throughout the week. This is time of the day. So what you notice is pre-pandemic, people basically played in the morning, probably made up some excuse about coming into work late. I don't know what. It seems 9 a.m. seems pretty late to me, but anyway. During the pandemic, it's just flat throughout the day. So golf is going through a total boom. And I'm not, I don't want to be too negative on this. If Paul is my boss and I really like golf and I work from home and I play golf and make it up in the evening, that's fine. On average, work from home has worked out. So I think this, in some ways, this is a positive take. I put this up because this is a more general phenomenon that's happening to gyms, to shopping malls, to hair salons. Anything that you call the leisure economy has swiveled from being really packed on the weekend to packed throughout the week. Whereas other things like commercial office space has gone from being used all week to packed in just 2 or 3 days. So this kind of twisted the economy. Some things have flattened out peak loading and other things have gone towards it. So to end, everything we've seen in some sense is just the beginning. So the final data point I'll show you is the share of patents that are published each week that mention work from home, telework, remote work, etc. So we look at patents as they're put out online as they're applied for. Pre-pandemic, it's about 0.5%. Pandemic start, and they have to require to mention it 3+ times, so to not be some kind of lawyer inserted, mention at the last minute. So post-pandemic, what we're seeing is the number of patents are slowly increasing as we go over time. This is kind of market size effects 101. So there is a huge increase in the market for work from home technologies. Tech firms, hardware firms, software firms are trying to come up with new things. When I've talked to a lot of firms, there's kind of amazing technologies out there. Like, one firm is telling me about holographic things. Another guy with company was saying, when you're on Zoom calls, it's very annoying. The camera's at the top of the laptop. And if I look into somebody's face, it looks like I'm looking at their shoes. They're now developing miniature cameras that are like 4 of them, and you use AI. So wherever you're looking, it looks like you're looking at people's eyes. There's all kinds of, apparently Apple's about to release some big, it's called the worst kept trade secret ever. It's about to release its secret new product later this year, which is some kind of headset aimed at working from home. So to end, work from home is here to stay. It's flatlined. We've kind of been, we're now 9 to 12 months into what's really a pretty stable pattern. It's typically 2 days a week for the average office worker. The key to success seems to be coordinate. The main thing is have people come in on the same days, work from home on the same days. Offices are being redesigned. They're not dead. Office market's a bit soft, but it's definitely not collapsed. And I'll stop and go to questions.
Nick, that was brilliant, and I was convinced entirely that working from home was a great thing until you started talking about golf. That we've got good half hour, a bit more than half an hour for questions to Nick. So if you'd like to raise your hand and ask questions, say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. Since you're there, Greg, the gentleman straight.
I'm Paul Taylor, I'm a charity trustee. Have you got any data on both physical health and mental health as a result of the changes in working patterns?
That's a really interesting question. I had a research meeting with 3 co-authors like an hour ago in the cafe, and they bought me a beer. You know, I didn't want to tell Paul, but I did drink a bit of it, but not too much. So we were talking about exactly this question. So I'll tell you what we know, which is if you look at hybrid, it looks like employers are significantly happier. One of the reasons is going back to the work by Richard Laird, Danny Kammerman, and others looking at these happiness surveys. If you look at hour by hour throughout the day, the thing that people hate the second most is working. The thing that people hate the most is commuting. So people hate commuting beyond all other activities, more or less. And so hybrid, for example, in the Trip.com experiment, people report significantly better job satisfaction, work-life balance, etc. They're allowed to work from home 2 days a week. So typically, 2 days a week looks good. You have a couple of days to de-stress, less commute, more time. It's less clear when you go to 4 or 5 days a week. That I don't have good data on. The anecdotes I heard on that are kind of mixed. So I think if you are, say, married with young kids or cohabiting with a partner with children, you have an active social life, you probably don't mind maybe being fully remote because you have social connections out of work. If on the other hand, you're newly hired into a city, you don't know anyone, you're single, you don't have kids, I suspect it could be very isolating to be at home 4 or 5 days a week. And in fact, in the earlier experiment I did back in 2010, we randomized people into working from home 4 days a week. We held that, they volunteered, by the way, and they held it after 9 months, we released it, and about half of them opted to go back in. When you asked them why, they said they were lonely. So my guess is, and we're trying to collect data, that mental health is probably maximized if you let people work from home probably 2 days a week. I don't have any strong evidence on that. I'm more nervous about fully remote. I think if people choose, that's okay. I think if people are forced into fully remote, that's probably more problematic. But it's a great question. Right now, I guess we're still trying to collect data, but I think that's the broad view on where things are.
Since you're standing there, why don't you chair yourself and identify the people you want to ask questions?
Alan Carter, HMRC. I was just wondering, is there any difference, do you think there's any difference between people who work in public administration, so things like tax authorities, and business? Is there any difference that you think might make a difference as to why, government departments might want to have a different approach than businesses, or is it essentially the same thing? And so good practice in business is going to be good practice in government?
So I'm not sure this is going to be the most popular answer, but I'll go ahead. So, okay, there's 2 facts. One is if you look at folks in the government, they tend to be well-educated working on computers. So that, I was in, Alan was actually I worked for Alan many, many years ago in the DTR in a summer job. So, and I was in the Treasury. This is typically graduate jobs on a computer. So that lends itself towards thinking hybrid. The one thing pushing back against too heavy amount of work from home in the public sector is come back to that Marissa Mayer point, which is you need to be able to have good performance management. So in jobs where it's harder to assess output, or where you can assess output, but the organization isn't very good at it, then it's less desirable to have heavy amounts of work from home. So at one extreme, there's a call center, whereby in call centers, it's really easy to assess. You just look at calls processed and quality assessed them. That's something that's easily done fully remotely. There's not much teamwork. You can, if you were managing me, you can see how many calls I process. On the other hand, if I was working for you coming up with new stories or something that's very creative and it's hard to evaluate, you may be worried if I was fully remote because there's no good performance management system. So to wrap that all up, if I interpret Jeremy Hunt's comments, I would, Jeremy Hunt's comments are a bit like interpreting some, religious scroll. There's various different ways to look at it, because he said the predominant mode, I think, is what is in the office. Is a, generous interpretation, I'd say what he's talking about is 3 days a week. I would have thought 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week at home, probably is a norm. That's kind of the norm in the private sector for managers and professionals. That would strike me as a pretty reasonable norm for the civil service. That's a skilled graduate job. I probably would be nervous of 3 and certainly 4 days a week unless I had very good performance evaluation metrics, because it's hard to manage people and hard to make sure they're working if they're entirely remote. Now, obviously, during the pandemic, we couldn't do anything about it, but we're now post-pandemic, so at this point, that's probably where I'd land. He could have, by the way, been talking about fully in the office, which I'm definitely, against. But if you interpret it generously, I'd say 3 days in the office, 2 at home. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. Peter Kane, IFS trustee. Do you think these developments could be a catalyst for more radical changes in working patterns and hours? I mean, there's some growing evidence that, for example, a move to 4-day weeks, shorter working hours, can both boost, maintain productivity, and again, give more improved work-life balance. Thank you.
Yes. But pre-pandemic, there was a strong connection between flexi place, which is work from home, and flexi time. So actually, pre-pandemic, I visited a bunch of people. I remember going, for example, to a call center. So an airline called JetBlue, probably, I don't know how many people have flown in it. Their call center was fully remote. I remember visiting the workers in the JetBlue call center, and they said the reason they did it is they had incredible flexibility in hours. So they'd say, work 2 hours, they'd take their kids to school, come back, work 3 hours, stop again. So work from home, because you remove the commute, makes job flexibility and also part-time much easier. So yes, and that's definitely already happening. The 4-day week is a bit more sensitive. I think the evidence is if you're say working 5 days a week for 8 hours a day, so that's 40 hours a week, and you go to 4 days a week for 10 hours a day, that certainly is very likely to maintain productivity. I'm kind of more skeptical on going to 4 days a week, 8 hours a day, which is 32 hours. That's kind of a lot like the French 35-hour week. There is some evidence on that. I would say the quality of that evidence is kind of mixed. And, there's a different debate. I think research on that is great. There's anything I want to see more research on is actually, in some ways you should have done more research on this 10, 20 years ago. It's a very lively topic, and I'm totally on board that there will be more flexibility. Telecommuting has opened this up. So I'll take Costas, then we should go at the back. Otherwise, I'm going to ask people on the front. Costas.
Great talk. Have you thought at all about gender gaps and how work from home affects men and women differently, both in the immediate run and the career structure?
So there's other people's research. I mean, you maybe know this better than me, that the impact of work from home has been worse with children on women than men, because they end up taking a higher load of childcare. And so I think there's research in academics. There's research in areas where you can more easily see outcomes and promotion. So for sure, particularly during the lockdown, the impact has not been gender neutral, and women look like they've suffered versus men. The other sense in which there is a gap, and as an economist, you kind of could see it both ways. If you look at the levels of work from home, they're gender neutral. If you look at preferences to work from home, there's about 5 to 6% higher preference to work from home in terms of share of days for women than men. The fact they're not realizing it, you can say there's some discrimination, there's gender. It's hard to quite interpret the data. When it's interesting, having talked to lots of female managers, that you do see stories going both directions. So the stories I've heard is, one is, if I'm the primary carer, it's easier to do that at home. If I have a nanny, and say I can supervise him or her if I'm at home. On the other hand, I've also heard stories of, if I'm the primary carer, I really don't want to be at home, because if something goes wrong, I'm grabbed and I can't work, and it's very hard to concentrate. So I think in general, it's good for both genders that want to work from home. Both genders particularly want to work from home with young kids. You do see some gap of women versus men. To be honest, the biggest gap we see in the data is on education, which is why I focused on that. But yes, there is a gender gap. And certainly during the pandemic, the burden of, the negative effect of work from home. And again, this is not my research. I can't remember the co-authors. If anyone knows, but I've seen several papers. I don't know. Do you have work? I don't know who does actually, but I've seen these papers showing that the impact has been, gender non-neutral. There's some hands at the back. I didn't want to entirely. Yeah, I can see someone's got a hand up. Yeah, exactly. Greg, why don't you pick some? Because I was saying.
Hi, Hugh Evans. I work at Department of Transport. I was going to ask a very similar question, but didn't quite answer my part of the question, but it's similarly on gender gaps. Wanted to know your thoughts on whether working from home and increased prevalence of it, obviously, whether it has the chance to reduce those gaps more specifically. So what the burden may be worse on women now in terms of they're at home, they're working, and they're looking after their kids. But obviously, a lot of research shows that the gender pay gap has a lot to do with women taking career breaks because of their kids.
Right.
Burden might be worse, but they might not have to take those breaks. So I'm guessing there's no good data on it yet, but do you think that working from home could in and of itself reduce the gender wage gap in that purest sense, even if the burden might be bigger?
Well, okay, again, a very interesting question. I think the thing we can feel slightly more confident about is it could hopefully reduce the labour force participation gap. So coming back to what I responded to Costas, if you look at preferences, both genders have a preference to work from home. I can't remember the exact numbers, but they definitely want to work from home. And it's higher with kids. It goes in every, the direction you expect. For women without kids, it's very similar to men. If you look at women with young kids, particularly under the age of 12, there's a gap versus men. Both are higher than without, but women jumps up even more. Given that, if employers are offering more work from home, that should help to improve labour force participation of women in particular. So you're offering something that they clearly value. By offering that, it should make it more appealing to work. And again, pre-pandemic, in fact, interesting enough, C-Trip, or I call them C-Trip and Trip because they changed their name. James Liak, the company Maria's son, Jane's son and the CEO of Maria's son, Trip has a very female-focused management philosophy. Almost half their employees are female, which in the Chinese tech sector is pretty rare. If you look at their management board, it's 50% female. They're very progressive on that. And therefore, in some ways, it's no surprise that they're being at the spearhead of work from home. They're way ahead of all the other Chinese tech companies. And one of the big reasons is they want to have more gender balance in their company. If you compare them to other Chinese tech companies, they're like 90% male. So yeah, I think this is, also, and there are other groups, disabled or another group, physically disabled, that are going to be major beneficiaries of that. I think it's really important to, this is all part of increasing labour force participation. Yeah, there's a question. I'll go furthest in the back. It's a very long, thin hall, so I'm sorry I can't see you.
Just a quick question. Do you have a view on who's done the best work so far on how do you become the best managed hybrid or organised hybrid? Who do you think's done the best work on that? Because it is the biggest challenge.
That's a hard question. Whoever I say, everyone else is going to feel upset. So there are a lot of companies. No, I'm not going to. Geez, you're putting me on the spot. I'm not going to name individuals at this point. You mean it? Well, there are companies. Generally the companies that I've talked to a lot of companies, the ones that I admire are the ones that relatively early on. I'll mention one company because it's not particular. So JPAL. So I don't know how many people know. JPAL is an academic. Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, Michael Kramer. It's basically a research company, but they have a couple of hundred employees. And Iqbal is their CEO, and I talked to him very early on. His wife is Geeta Gopinath, who's like the deputy head of the RMF. So I talked to him right from the get-go several times about work from home. They pretty rapidly moved to a system of actually Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the office, Thursday, Friday at home. I spoke a lot to Lazard's, Peter Orzag. They relatively fast went to that too. I don't want to be too prescriptive, so just to give you an example of where that can go wrong, I spoke to Yale University, and the Office of General Counsel said they have a very different policy. The OGC is the lawyers, and they said, look, we all come in on Wednesday, and then all of us need to come in one other day, and we actually spread it out to make sure we have cover. So their view is, look, we don't actually mostly work as a team. We get Wednesdays for teamwork. A lot of the time we're dealing with problems and we're helping professors at the university deal with legal issues. So we need somebody on the ground in case something blows up. So it's not always the case that people want to come in, but I think function, purpose leads function. And so generally, the most important thing is being deliberate, I have to say. The thing that didn't work well in 2021 is people saying, well, you can come in if you like, not come in if you like. What happens is you come in and half your colleagues are there and half aren't. Therefore, every time we have a meeting, you have to get on Zoom because there's always somebody not in the room, and then people complain and they say there's no energy and I'm on Zoom all day, so I'm going to go home. And that's kind of a recipe to end up with a more or less empty office.
Thanks. Ben Zaranko from the IFS. If sectors like healthcare and education can't offer work from home to their employees,
do you think they'll have to pay more to compensate? Will one equilibrium outcome of all this be higher pay in sectors like that to compensate for the lack of work from home possibility?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I was actually having this conversation. My father works in the NHS, and Paul and I were talking about this earlier today. I'm aware that NHS, it would be an understatement to say NHS salaries have not kept up with, labour market, and the education system's the same thing. I was actually told, a friend of mine told me about their friend that was an NHS doctor that had quit to become an office administrator because they wanted to work from home 2-3 days a week. And they'd done years of training to say, look, I really need to work from home 2-3 days a week. So it is definitely the case that if you can't offer work from home, in equilibrium, you want to offer more money. In fact, you can see what's happened in the labor. So I know the US labor market better than the UK on this, but if you look in the US, since the pandemic's begun, people like me, or pretty much all of us, university grads, have seen their pay go up by about 5% a year. Like Stanford's pay settlement was 5% a year. Inflation's 8-9. So we have had a real pay cut. And that's happened 2-3 years in a row. So look, I'm not complaining, we're well paid, but in real terms, our pay is probably down 5-10%. If you look at frontline workers, or people say McDonald's or Chipotle or KFC, or in hospitals, etc., in their private hospitals, they've tended to go up by 10-15% because it's so hard to hire anyone. If you visit any kind of shopping mall, it's full of hire help wanted. What that's meant is over the last 3 years, there's been actually a big reduction in the university, or what's it called, college, non-college wage gap. In fact, it's fallen by about a quarter. It's kind of amazing. So I was listening to David Autor talking about it. If you look from 1980 to 2019, there's been a huge increase in inequality, and about 1/4 of that in the US has unwound in the last 3 years in terms of college wage gap. And that really reflects labor market responses to work from home, because all of us have work from home. It's a really nice perk. It's worth 8%. It's something really valuable. Our labor supply has been pretty high. If you look at graduates, the labor supply rates are overtaken where they were pre-pandemic. If you get long grads, they had to come into work every day. They had to mask. They have infection risk. It's not as pleasant. Some of them have just retired early and pulled out. So yes, NHS doctors, people in schools look like the group that should get a pay increase because they're not getting to work from home, but they haven't. So, this is we're talking about, this is a huge issue for the UK because it affects the public finances, but it's pretty clear that they have not kept up with where they should. Both my sisters are in the NHS, so I kind of see, I guess it sounds very self-serving, but it's the horror stories we hear and you see about these pay rates, and then you're right, you throw on top of that, they can't work from home. In some senses, in the private sector, you should compensate for that. So I agree. Healthcare, education, there are other sectors that are like that, but those are the kind of most obvious. Yeah, there's a question.
Andrew Mason Williams. Is there any evidence that you have on school attendance rates, the impact of working from home? I've certainly seen some anecdotal evidence, but got anything to inform us?
So I don't have, I tell you the evidence, and again, my personal anecdote is online teaching is really not great. So, that's maybe an understatement again, but I personally was online teaching. I remember I was teaching a class during the pandemic broke, and I told the class, I'm not a big fan of teaching on Zoom. So why don't you go home? When the lockdown's over in 3 weeks, we'll resume in person. I couldn't have been it was hard to get how wrong it in every time. So eventually I had to resume on Zoom. My year of teaching on Zoom was just so different from teaching in person. It was like going from broadband to the old dial-up. Basically, just the bandwidth, because on Zoom, you can kind of talk for 5 minutes and you have to stop to cold call and have a class discussion because it's just so boring for people to be lectured. So I took, an hour and a half material and I could get through maybe 30 minutes, and that was it. And in fact, a lot of the class was therapy and people cold calling, having discussion. So I think the evidence and everything I've heard is, if you're in rural Kenya, where there is no in-person alternative, then online teaching is probably great. If you're in London or New York and San Francisco, where there's schools nearby, you should almost certainly go in. I know there's also evidence. I saw a piece in the New York Times last week about the enormous gaps in standardized testing. And it's actually interestingly across the income, it's across all income levels. So even, the top 5%, the very wealthy who had pods and tutoring and stuff at home, even they have seen testing gaps, both in maths and reading. So it's clear the pandemic has damaged education. I have 4 kids, and it was not great. It was, I'd say they clearly did. It was just a mess. So I'm not against online teaching. I think it worked. My old next door neighbor in Stanford actually founded one of these online teaching company, Sebastian Thrun. But I think it's kind of specialized for maybe execs. I know a lot of business schools are doing it for execs that are very tired after a day of work. They're pretty motivated. They do 2 hours of exec ed. It's probably not well aimed at 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds or university undergrads who really need to be in the classroom. I mean, I feel part of my role in the classroom as a professor is like a personal trainer. Personal trainers just get you to do what you should be doing anyway. They just give you incentive. It's kind of like I'm in the classroom to get kids to not be on Instagram or not be messaging each other. They're like, at least that hour and a half, they're in my class. In fact, I try and get them to close their laptops and just focus. So, yes, I'm not a huge, and I don't think online education has taken off in mainstream. I know LSE, UCL, pretty much every university I know has gone back to pretty much full-time in-person teaching. Person at the back, thanks.
Hello, thank you. I'm Pen Zhang. I come from Queen Mary University, London. So work from home is a big thing now, but I want to ask you, what made you interested in this policy maybe 15 years ago? And what was your experience doing this research before the COVID? So do you feel that people are interested in this experimental policy, or you have to work hard to persuade them is a big thing in the future? Thank you.
To be honest, I was really lucky. I completely 100% did not. I definitely didn't see the pandemic coming. If I'd seen it coming, I'd have been shorting stock. I wouldn't be here. I'd be like, flying around. I'd be probably buy some, Premier League. Well, I won't tell you which team I'd buy, but I would buy a team. So I think there are 3 things. One is, the experience growing up with my parents, seeing them work from home. Second is an enormous thanks to Wendy Carlin. I'm not sure if she's here, but Wendy Carlin was nudged John and I many years ago to put in questions on work-life balance. So this goes back to 2004, and that's the first stuff I did. And I put in some questions in a survey around on work-life balance, kind of nudged by Wendy. And then the third thing, I was just very lucky that James Liang, who is it was such a weird experience. James Liang, who was at this point the chairman, he founded this company called Ctrip. It was listed on NASDAQ. It was worth like 8 billion. I had no idea he was the chairman. He was the largest single shareholder with like 5%. So if you do the math, you can imagine this as an extremely wealthy individual sitting at the back of my class. I had no idea who this was. I was teaching, and about a third of the way through the class, someone had said, "Do you know who that is?" I was like, "No." And then I was like, it was amazing. And James, when I went to talk to him, said, "We have this big head office in Shanghai. We're growing. It's full of people on call centers, because back then, a lot of travel booking, rather than being online in China, was by telephone. It's too expensive to have space. So we're thinking of doing work from home. We're not sure, et cetera, et cetera." So we set up the original randomized control trial. So that was, again, a good piece of fortune. But it wasn't really deliberate. To be honest, it wasn't a major research agenda until 2020, in which case, it's pretty clear we needed to do something on it. The other trigger for me is, because it happened so fast, there wasn't great data on it. Actually, the ONS, to their credit, in the UK was very fast at collecting good work from home data. And I've been working with Paul Meason and others here to try and collect work from home data. In the US, the census was slower. So I showed you that chart. They hadn't really collected good data till 2022. So there's a total data vacuum. So that's partly why I got into it. So I was getting asked, what do we know? And it wasn't particularly sophisticated research. It was just running basic surveys to try and get some data.
Hi there, my name is Bharti Kishore from the Chartered Management Institute, and I just wanted to ask you, what's your take on the importance of management practices on maximizing the productivity from hybrid working?
So, again, really interesting. I think, again, this is like a Quentin Tarantino movie, connecting up all these threads of conversation. So, I think I was talking to Paul about this earlier, but there's a number of, so Daniela Skur, Hanata Lima, some of, various people have, Megapatnik have run regressions whereby they've looked at firms based on pre-pandemic management evaluations and what's happened during the pandemic and their adoption of work from home. What you find is pre-pandemic, better managed firms have had much higher adoption rates of work from home. And I think where you're heading is it's very much like that Marissa Mayer story. So if I had really good performance management, I can relax a bit and let people work from home 3 days a week. If I'm like old school management by walking around, looking at people at their desk, it's really stressful. I'm one of those firms that purchase surveillance software. I mean, this surveillance software is horrible. I don't know if people remember, but early in the pandemic, there's people taking camera shots and, recording keyboard strokes. One of my friends told me the best story. He said his sister, who's actually in Colombia in South America, works for a company that was doing keyboard stroke recording. And if you didn't touch a keyboard for like 10 minutes, they'd define you as slacking. And so she apparently said when she takes the dog for a walk, she gets her mum to press the space bar. And it's like, you know, this stuff is so ridiculous. And so that is kind of input management remotely. So well-managed firms were much better at adopting and faster to adopt work from home. There's kind of a circular thing now. When I talk to companies, the biggest single piece of advice is get proper performance management systems. If you don't have 360 reviews, some data collection, some ways to evaluate employees, you can't really have them working remotely. And if you do, it's much better for them. So this is kind of a circular system. Yeah.
Aloysius Lipp, HM Treasury. Thanks very much, Nick. I wondered if you could offer some thoughts on the apparent disparity between the 1 to 2% growth in productivity compared to the, well, I'm not sure if you caught one of the sessions earlier at the conference, but it's about a 6% drop in wage compensation, which some firms have successfully managed to implement in sort of compensation for this amenity value to workers. And then secondly, if that has any implications for policymakers who are trying to target productivity because of its association with welfare and wage, but if there's growing disparity, is that still a good thing? And markups.
So there is, so it's kind of a complicated equilibrium thing. So in terms of coming back to the question earlier, there is a wage growth difference between people that can and can't work from home. So work from home is worth about, as I mentioned, 8% in amenity value. It's meant that graduates have increased labor supply. That's slightly pushed down the wage rate that graduate jobs are paying. And that was that discussion earlier that if you look at, people in McDonald's versus managers, that wage gap has closed a bit. And people at McDonald's are still paid way less, but that way less is a bit less. So it's hard to say whether, the manager wages have actually gone down in real terms. Where they'll end up in the long run is less clear. So maybe you could say their wages have fallen, whether it's, because of work from home or, I'm not sure. The story that employers have grabbed the money from them, in a relatively competitive market, I feel it's more like labor supply, labor demand, equilibrium playing out. In terms of productivity, if I was like the MPC or the FOMC, the main thing I think work from home does is it actually increases labor supply. So it pushes up growth rates. So if, for example, I can't remember labor force participation rates, but they're about 70%. So if you say push labor force participation rates up from 70 to 72%, that's an amazing thing. You've increased the labor force by, a bit, 2.5%. And if you spread that over 5 years, that's a huge increase in growth, particularly in the UK. I mean, UK productivity growth is basically flat. So if you think it's productivity times labor supply, productivity is not growing, at least if labor is growing, that's going to drive growth. So my take on this is it's all about really the main benefits are going to be increasing labor supply. And it's most particularly people close to retirement, people with disabilities, people with young kids, people maybe that live in very rural areas that don't want to commute 5 days a week. You can think of these margins. That, I think, is by far the biggest macro gain that will come out.
Nick, I'm going to interrupt you at that point just to ask or say that's really not what's happening in the UK. We've had exactly the opposite. I mean, one interpretation of what you're saying is we shouldn't worry that there's a post-pandemic blip, and actually all of these forces are going to mean that we look back in a few years' time and all of these people in their 50s will go back into work, and we'll see some reversal of what seems this extraordinary number of people with sickness and disability problems who are out of work. I know it's not quite the same in the US, but our experience here really is that we've lost a large chunk of the workers, particularly over the age of 50. I mean, I don't know whether you've looked at that or whether you have any views as to why that might be or why that's, as it were, contrary to, I agree, what you would expect.
No, you're saying in the US, there's this phenomenon called long social distancing, which is people that are basically, if you look who it is, there tends to be people above the age of 50. They're typically less educated. It actually skews slightly female. I don't know in the UK, but this group have pulled out the labor market. It's hard to, in survey data, it looks like these are people who've had friends and family that have died or been, had serious hospitalized with COVID. My interpretation is there's a short-run negative effect of this. In the long run, eventually it's this thing where, it's the pandemic, the medical effect of the pandemic wears its way through. We'll see longer, higher levels of labor supply. But you're right. In the US, in fact, if you look, graduates is now up, but non-graduates is still below. And a lot of this is long social. If you look at who it is, it tends to be 50 plus, and it's people that in surveys say they have friends and family that have had COVID, and they basically don't want to go back to work.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, thank you for...
We've got 5 minutes, so last couple of questions.
Hi there, Matthew Coombs from the Centre for Cities. We actually have a working from home report coming out on Wednesday, so I'm happy to send it. I'm interested in why the UK seems to be the higher working from home share of the hybrid jobs, and also
on the job stuff.
On the job stuff, and also working from home days. Why is it higher than Europe at least?
Some of this stuff comes to standard. You know, the jobs posting stuff depends a bit on, you know, which industries post the most. I would say my take on it is the UK is probably up there with the US, Australia, Canada. It's hard to say whether it's higher or lower. There are at least 3 data sets I showed you. One is office occupancy, one was online postings, and one was surveys. They show that the UK is relatively similar. It's very different from, say, Spain or Greece. So to be clear, there's, you know, Anglo-Saxon countries are highest. Germany, Sweden, you know, Northern Europe is also pretty high. The UK is, I don't think it's an outlier, but it's, you know, we're actually running another big survey right now. So in about a month, oddly enough, there's very bad international data. So there's great, you know, there are different data sets that are good nationally. Trying to compare internationally has become very hard. There's Google Workplace Mobility data. I don't know if anyone else used that, but that stopped being tracked as of September 2022. That tracked people's movements with mobile phones, but for various reasons, that became kind of not a good measure after that. So yeah, more data is what we need. But I think my, you know, 30,000 foot view is the UK looks relatively similar to North American levels of work. Oh yeah, here we go, Carol.
I wanted to follow up. Sorry. Cara Proper. I wanted to follow up actually on the first question where you replied with response to mental health. But the interesting thing about all these people playing golf in the middle of the week and gyms being full, what do you think the implications are for physical health?
You'd think it will, I don't know. I mean, there's various things. I know people going, there's all those studies that look at people when they come to mandatory retirement, and I think normally health deteriorates with retirement. Again, Carrie, you know this much better than me, so I'm looking at you for, you know, reassurance here. In the original C-TRIP survey in China in 2010 and 2011, we actually asked people health questions, and it wasn't, I actually was expecting their health to get worse, so they're working from home 4 days a week. You think they may go out less, it's easier to kind of sit at home and, you know, this fridge, bed, television story. We didn't see any positive or negative. Now, maybe that was only a 9-month study. Maybe those people on average in their 20s. I could see it going both ways, actually. I could see you have more access to leisure facilities and time to go for a walk or for a jog. On the other hand, in some sense, I think there's some benefit of getting out of the house, and some people that have a fair amount of exercise and commuting, maybe moving around in the workplace. So I think it's actually a really interesting question. You know, anyway, I don't know. This is a free floor. If anyone knows I don't know. I haven't seen strong evidence in either direction, actually. I'm trying to remember. I have seen some stuff on mortality rates. I think the one thing I saw was non-COVID mortality rates in the pandemic. Didn't they go up? Isn't that right? But it's hard. I mean, it could be no one wants to go into hospital. So I don't know, actually. I think one thing I should say for, you know, any PhD students out here in particular, there's tons of open questions here, and there's a real shortage of data. If, you know, a lot of the data I've shown comes from companies. So you can persuade some company to give you data. There's some really fascinating questions or, you know, get data from health outcomes, actually. One thing we saw in the US is a great instrument for levels of work from home is extent of lockdown. It doesn't work in the UK because I think lockdown was uniform. In the US, I was looking at this the last couple of weeks. Places that had a very long lockdown, work from home levels are much higher now, even controlling for pre-pandemic. And the story very much is if you lock people down for 5 months, they buy home computers, they get used to it, they shift to home, some of that lasts. And so that generates a bit of a natural experiment to then look later on. Is it related to health effects, you know, a few years down the road? I should stop. I know, yeah, thank you very much.
That was wonderful. I think we've learned so much. We've learned so much this evening. I mean, one thing that's been great is that was upbeat, which is not often what you get from an economist nowadays. So thank you very much for that, Nick. Another thing I think we've learned is that actually working on things which aren't immediately apparently important can really bear fruit. So actually giving academics the freedom to work on stuff that only becomes important as it happens when you have a pandemic is great. The third thing we've learned is that the IFS trains people extraordinarily well, both to do fantastic economics and to speak incredibly well. And the fourth thing you've learned is that I really meant it when I said I want to get to the drink. So thank you, Nick. I mean, it really was fantastic, and perhaps we can all show our appreciation once more.